Welcome to the Sustainable Dish Podcast. I'm Diana Rogers, a real food registered dietitian, author, and sustainability advocate. I co-host this podcast with James Connolly, who was a producer on my film, Sacred Cow. I also founded the Global Food Justice Alliance, an initiative advocating for the inclusion of animal-sourced foods like meat, dairy, and eggs for a more nutritious, sustainable, and equitable worldwide food system. You can check it out and join me at globalfoodjustice.org. Thanks again for listening, and now on to our show. If you're looking for a guide to help you get your diet back on track, to help you feel your very best, and to learn more about meat's role in a healthy and sustainable and ethical food system, then I highly recommend you take my Sustainivore course. I've condensed all of my knowledge in human nutrition and agriculture and have made it accessible to everyone in 8 easy modules. There are quizzes, tips, and motivational emails to keep you on your journey. It also comes with a free cookbook and other great bonuses. So eat for your health, the planet, and your values. Head to sustainivore.com today and check it out. Welcome back to the Sustainable Dish Podcast, everyone. So James and I have a special episode for you. As you've been maybe listening to the last few episodes, I've been alerting people that we are wrapping up the Sustainable Dish Podcast. And so I thought it would be appropriate to have one of our final podcasts with James Connolly, my co-host, to kind of reflect on some of the podcasts that we've recorded, some of our favorite ones, and just kind of have a little kind of say goodbye to the podcast episode. So welcome, James.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, it's always nice to catch up. And I'm very sad that it's changing in some ways. I think that podcasting is really hard, right? I think especially if you want to do justice to all the stories that we're putting together and do justice to the people who are kind of working in the same field or tangentially to us and do all of that stuff. I think we've had some amazing episodes over the years. And, like that's how I met you, was through a podcast, was listening to that. And, I just remember like just years and years ago when Sacred Cow was kale versus cow. That's when we first met, and just kind of talking about that and seeing the evolution of your career and, everything that's been associated with the film and the progress that we've made and the conversations we've had because of it. It's been really, really quite special.
Yeah. And I haven't really, talked much about like why I'm ending the podcast. So I can just kind of let listeners know, I have never made a dime. It has been a financial loss for me ever since I very first started it. And, with all of my travel, it was just getting harder and harder to, record 6 podcasts in a week and then take off for a little bit and, keep things fresh and keep it going. And I've been, so effective with global food justice and with all of the, I just got back from Uruguay. I was in Canada earlier and Australia before that. And so my energy towards global food justice is what's most important to me right now. I think I may still, when there's interesting studies that come out or whatever, I may still, record and post on YouTube when I feel moved to do so. But the weekly podcast and maintaining that grind of a schedule, now that I'm an old lady, officially turning 50 next week. You're close behind me, right?
I know. January hit 50.
Yeah. So, I think we get our AARP kind of senior moments where we're allowed to, pivot and focus on what's really important. And so, although the podcast has been amazing and really informed the film Sacred Cow, is time for it to go to bed. So
Yeah, and it's still a recording of a lot of the things that we've learned, the arguments in longer form. There's just there's a lot of there's so many elements of this that I'm still trying to learn. And one of the joys of it was it was terrifying for me to be on the podcast. I remember the first couple interviews I did. I remember actually watching myself, like, as
You like
like leaving my
dissociated?
body, totally dissociated, and would go into this state where I'm like, just pay attention to what they're saying, don't think of the next question, like all of this stuff
Yeah.
associated with that. But you originally came to me because you were like, you have all of this curiosity, you don't have an outlet for that. I'm going to force you to kind of do this, so that you can talk about the things that kind of matter to you.
Yeah.
And being in New York City, there's not a lot of people who want to talk about this stuff.
Right.
They don't want to talk about soil health. They don't want to talk about, like range management. Right?
Yes,
They don't want to talk about ruminant digestion.
I
They don't want to
made
talk about any of
you
these things.
I made you volunteer for the podcast because it would be good for you. That's what I
Yeah.
told you. So
Yeah.
thank you for your service. I really appreciate you taking some of the load off. And also, I mean, for me, a lot of the guests are people that I've met at conferences, that I'm familiar with their work. I saw them speak or whatever. But your job was a little different in that you didn't have that exposure to a lot of the guests. And so you were like reading a 400-page book and then, trying to track down the author, try to get them on the podcast cold. And so that's very different than what I was doing, which was just kind of like winging it because I had dinner with someone at a conference after watching their presentation. So my job was a
Yeah.
lot easier than your job, and I appreciate what you did.
Yeah, I would never like tell the author of the book that I had read their book and the book they had written before that, and like, like 20 articles in order to sit down or anything like that, because I felt it would be completely overwhelming. But I felt like it was, like, I think if you want to understand an author's point of view, that they have to encapsulate it within a book, but there are so many sort of myriad entities that go into their worldview. I just want to understand where they were coming from. And,
Mhm.
some of them ghost you, right? So like some of them
Yeah, you had
you've
that problem.
prepared.
Yeah.
And some of it is it'll be associated with, everybody gets busy. Scheduling is sometimes a complete nightmare. International scheduling can sometimes be really hard.
Yeah.
Like I remember when I did an interview, on hoof prints on the land. She primarily works in Rajasthan in India. She's a camel herd veterinarian. And I just happened to be able to get her while she was in Germany. So we were able to kind of work out some of the timing on that. And that was
Yeah.
just a really, really wonderful story kind of coming across from halfway around the globe. And you've had that as well, I think, talking to people in India and talking to people about, like, this is a global issue. Like trying to get everything to kind of work so that you can sit down with somebody for an hour, to get their worldview. And the thing that I love most about this is that so many people were devoted to so many different aspects of this and had different whys as to why they got into this and why they were passionate about it. And so it was really fun to explore their whys.
Yeah,
Um,
I
it's really cool.
agree. Yeah, in fact, I made a list before we got on the phone or on Zoom here, of kind of my highlight episodes, but you're reminding me that I forgot one, and that is Sylvia Karpagam, who
Mm,
is a public health doctor from India. Who, I mean, the anti-meat narrative going on in India is really intense because there's like classism involved. I mean, it's basically you've got one class that is claiming to be vegetarian, that even though they're not in reality really
mm,
vegetarians, because a lot of them, will eat meat when they go out or hide it or whatever. But then you've got a different class of people who can't afford meat often, but really need it. And Sylvia is really trying to point out that, these kids are going to school because of the meal. Like that's their main driver to go to school.
Right.
And a lot of these Muslim majority communities in rural India, and you've got a school lunch program that is largely run by a very religious group that is sort of a quasi-government group that it won't even not they don't have meat, but they don't even have like onions and garlic and spices. So the food is like incredibly not only nutrient poor, but also bland. And so the kids aren't going to school because the food stinks. And so you've got malnourished and undereducated
Mm.
rural people there. So that podcast was really fantastic. And I have a lot of respect for Sylvia because what's going on over there with, if you're even rumored to have meat in your house, you might get stoned to death.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and since the Narendra Modi kind of took over, he is sort of a Hindu nationalist, very big fan of the caste system, very anti-Muslim, but lives that kind of like very ascetic lifestyle. He claims to never have had sex. He he was married, but he lives this very like he's always fasting. He's always living off of tea. He tries to live this very pure, like the worldview sort of aspect of it. But a lot of
yeah.
it is really centered around Hindu nationalism. And so you see within the Muslim minority within the country, they're essentially being persecuted in many different ways. And one of them is through diet. So if anybody is, there are butcher shops that are being shut down, slaughterhouses. You can see a lot of that stuff sort of happening. We tried to send GoPros to Sylvia because working on Death in the Garden, we thought her perspective, a lot of the visual imagery might actually like work really well. We just couldn't make it through the customs system there.
Oh, geez.
So everything sort of got lost a little bit. And then the excise taxes and everything like that would have cost us, the price of a GoPro in order to get it to Sylvia. It was just an absolute mess.
Wow.
So somewhere in India are a bunch of GoPros that were supposed to film all of this stuff that will never see the light of day.
Yeah, wow. Well, my friends who are from that area of the world, India, Sri Lanka, I mean, they talk about how people complain about racism in America and they just have no idea. Once you go to some of these other countries and see how people are persecuted for the color of their skin or their religion. It's very intense. So hats off to Sylvia Karpagum, number one on the list here, but certainly not in any specific order. I don't know if you want to go next with your favorite podcast, but I just thought we'd kind of like just reflect on the
Yeah,
ones
I
we
mean,
like the best.
yeah, one of the things I really did love Hoof Prints on the Land, just because I think that her her methodology for kind of like laying out the story of camel herding in India is actually really fun, and she has such a deep love for the caste that is the camel herding population, but how integrated their farming system is with the manure and urine and management that happens in India. And so one of the funnier stories was she would go back to Germany um, and then come back to India to visit, and they'd be like, "Tell me about the grass in Germany." They were absolutely obsessed. Like everything was about this idea of like it's being wasted if it's not being fed to animals, right? And so it's just a completely different worldview. They view the land in a very different way than we do. And it just reminded me a lot of hunter gatherers. Like if you walk through the forest, a hunter gatherer will be able to sell sign and markings and a myriad, 1,000 things that we just can't see. And so you have these camel herders who are really valued for the nutrition that they bring, for the meat that they bring, and for their culture as well. It's a really beautiful culture that's slowly sort of dying away. And the cost to that is, in essence, in terms of the vegetable And other parts of agriculture means that they're actually not getting a lot of the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and all the other elements being laid on the land after harvest. So what they do is they bring those the goats and the sheep in, and they bring the camels in after harvest, and they clean up all the roughage that is left behind, and then they poop on the land, and they're part of an active cycle. And just the way that she kind of leads you into all of this stuff. So she, with a number of different people, had built an entire edifice around pastoralist communities where she was trying to get people from all over the world to kind of like meet up and talk about the problems with pastoralism, the things that that could be improved upon, but also the value of pastoralism. One of the stories that she has in there is about Spain and the transhumance movement, that all the sheep herders that the wool on the sheep, in essence, is a perfect carrier for seed as it moves from like place to place. So they have these, incredible roads that are in essence just for pastoralist communities that move through that whole landscape, but they bring fertility and fecundity with them wherever they go. So it was really cool to kind of just
Wow.
talk to somebody who's like spent their entire lives like devoted to this, and just like to
Yeah.
just riff on, things that you just don't typically think about with that stuff, you know.
Yeah, you're reminding me. I mean, we haven't really talked, but about my trip, but I just got back from Uruguay, and there's this group of regenerative female farmers there that I spent the first like 5 days with. The Pampianas, they call themselves, and so it's the women of the Pampas, uh, and very similar stories and passion. And some of them are only making like $30 a hectare when they could be making 500 if they were to plant soy there. But they're healing the land, and it that can only come from the passion that they have for managing the livestock and loving that way of life. And it was really moving. So it's neat. It's neat to talk to people from all over the world that are so passionate about this.
Yeah.
Um, all right, I'm gonna go next. My next favorite one was relatively recently. Um, Pablo Manzano,
Right.
Spanish researcher who did some work looking at the Serengeti and comparing the pastoralists there to wild herds of wildebeest and all kinds of animals, and found that the wildebeest were actually emitting the same, if not more, methane than the cattle, but the cattle were actually performing the same ecosystem function. So the conclusion of Pablo and the other researchers on the paper were that cattle can be effective substitutes for wild animals. Basically, you know, putting a pin, like denying that rewilding is the solution, which I've been, you and I have been saying all along. But some of our most fierce opponents in this argument that we've been making are the rewilder. It's not even the vegans, it's the rewilders, right? They're wanting to just kind of let nature have its place and leave it alone. And all right, so wolves get to eat and humans don't. I don't know, so I was super impressed with that one. That's episode 244.
Mm.
All right.
Yeah. So that takes me into, so it was one of my first conversations, and it was funny because so I found a book in a used bookstore on like St. Mark's Place, and it was a book called Serengeti Rules, and I picked it up because I know like it just had elephants on the front, and I was carrying it around with me, and I walked to the East Village, and I saw premiering that week, I think it was Tribeca Film Festival, was a documentary, Serengeti Rules. And I was like, what is this? It's like a serendipitous moment. Now, in Serengeti Rules, his basic argument is that there are keystone species within every ecosystem, and the removal of those keystone species, some are predators, some are prey, the removal of that, it it has a fundamental shift in the ecology of that system, and a lot of them are predators. And so the argument that I remember him and the way that I interpreted the argument was really centered around this idea that really the prey species are the ones that will take over and create a monoculture if they're given the chance. They will completely eat away at a system unless they have something, that keystone predator species in there. So the example that he uses is starfish. Starfish are a predator species, and so he takes these tidal pools and he removes all of the starfish. And what ends up happening is the sea urchins kind of take over, and then there's nothing else. There's no biodiversity anymore because essentially you have this one species that propagates beyond control. And
Which is not just a thought experiment; it's actually happens. Like it's actually happening. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the stories that it tells, the reason why he called it Serengeti rules was because of the wildebeest population. After the vaccination against rinderpest happened, you had this massive decrease in wildebeest population, because there was a disease that was brought over from India, by Italian colonialism when they tried to take over Ethiopia. They essentially didn't inoculate or segregate their cows when they brought them over, and so they, in essence, sort of like let this out into the wild. There was a massive decrease in population, and the wildebeest, when they inoculated the cows against it, and eventually the wildebeest, you started to see this explosion in population. That explosion of population, everybody was freaking out in the same way that, like, Savory, remember when Savory was kind of talking about elephant populations? They were like, we have to cull this. It's going from 300,000 to 500,000 to 800,000. And one of the scientists was like, wait a second, let us see what nature does. And what he saw was, I think it had ended up sort of plateauing at 1.2 million wildebeest. And so what ended up happening in the Serengeti was you had this millions of these ruminant animals coming through. And then you started an explosion in cheetah population, exploded in lion population, started moving them around. So then you start to saw like acacia trees starting to come back. You start to see all of these different other plant species coming back. And then you saw primates, everything. The whole explosion of the Serengeti happened because these wildebeest population were essentially doing what they have been doing for a very long time. This was such a cool story, you know?
Yeah.
And it is one of the most beautiful documentaries too. It's like visually, the storytelling in it is actually really, really beautifully done. So that was a big get for me. That was like, you're starting to walk in podcasting, and suddenly I meet this guy, and his resume is off the charts, like
Yeah.
3 pages long. And I was like, I am not worthy to talk to this guy, but he was super kind, and we just had a really nice conversation. It was like 3 days before Christmas, and he took time out of his day to just have a conversation with me. So it was really cool.
Yeah. It is, I'm going to add that to my list because I've, heard about the book. I did not read it, and I have not seen that documentary. So I'm going to add that to it. Cool. It is amazing how many people we've spoken to that I'm like, who are you? Right. To be talking to me,
Right.
Incredible.
Yeah. What's next?
Let's see. I'm going to go with way back to Lauren Manning. And the episode I recorded with her right before she was my co-host for a little bit before you. So I met her because of an Instagram post that she did, where some people stole her goat. So this is way back, episode 98. And I'm foggy on the details of the whole story, but essentially, people came, they took her goat, they were activists, and she ended up trying to have a dialogue with them. She posted the whole story on Instagram, and I reached out to her.
Do you want more of the details? Because I remember.
Oh, yes, please.
I think it was it. So she had an Instagram. She had hashtagged something that was an animal rights group hashtag.
That's it.
She put it into one of her posts, not knowing what it was. It sent all of these people to her, and she got relentlessly attacked on Instagram. Then somebody found out where she lived, and we think, I mean, we don't really know, but one of her goats disappeared one night, was quote unquote rescued, right? And then she wrote this really beautiful, wonderful short piece on, and you continue. Yeah.
That, yes, on Instagram, a long time ago, but it was a beautiful piece.
Yeah.
You're you're
She was like,
remembering better than me. Keep
and
going, keep going.
no, and she was like, and he just really loves raw carrots. Like that was the thing I remember. It was like she just knew every animal that she was taking care of so
Mm,
well, and she
yeah,
was like, if you're going to take care of him, please take care of him in the
yeah,
way that I have. Yeah,
right. Yeah.
yeah,
So that was really, really special. Yeah, another one, that, speaking of people that are like, who are you? I can't believe you're talking to me, Nick Offerman. So I had Nick
right.
Offerman on my podcast, which kind of blows my mind. And it was really mostly about his book, that he came out with not too long ago, about going out in the woods and visiting a bunch of national parks, driving an Airstream around in the middle of COVID. But I'm so happy to say that he and I are like friends now. I had no idea who he was, and the name like kind of rang a bell, but I didn't even know because I hadn't watched Parks and Rec. I'm not like a huge TV watcher.
Mm,
And when I was in England shooting at James Rebanks's farm, we're packing up and everything, and it was a late night. We're trying to get out to Manchester to actually record with Patrick Holden the very next day.
mm.
And James said to us, Nick Offerman's coming tomorrow. And I was like, who? And he's like,
Mm.
Nick Offerman, the guy with the mustache. And I was like, I think I know who that is. I don't know.
Yeah,
So, I called up I had like one internet bar up at James's farm. I looked him up and went through many, many different channels to try to convince him to be the narrator of Sacred Cow.
yeah,
And unfortunately, COVID made it so I couldn't meet him in person when he was doing the voiceover for the film. But I just do remember that after almost every sentence he read, he's like, God damn it, I'm so glad you're making this film. Like, he was just so into it. He's like, I don't think a lot of people understand. They think, oh, funny that you had Ron Swanson narrate it, but Nick really, truly believes in Regen Ag and cares about this movement very much. And he's probably the only celebrity out there that really does get it. And
yeah.
so I had him on episode 173 and, have back and forth with him often. Uh, so there you go, episode 173, another one in the books for me as one of my favorites. How about you for next one?
I want to say that. So I want to say there was. So one of the most excited I was about doing an interview that I just feel like I didn't. If I was a better interviewer, I might have been able to kind of pull out more of the strings associated with it. There was a book that came out about a year ago. It's called The Devil's Element, and it's Dan Egan's book about phosphorus. Um, and it's one of the sort of like, first of all, it is a really, really wonderful romp through history. Like you take this one element, you take that and you follow it through this sort of thread line as you move in and through agriculture. Phosphorus is also used in a myriad number of different you know industries. But one of the things that we sort of stood in awe, like reading this, was that you could take something so integral to life. Carl Sagan says In essence, like the limits to life on this planet are due to one element and one element alone, that is phosphorus.
Mm.
They say we can't make it, we can't like do anything with it. All we can do is recycle it, and it recycles through primarily through animals. So I had gone down to Florida because I went to a place that's actually profiled in here. It's called Bone Valley. Um, and a lot of the fertilizer firms like Mosaic are down there, Nutrient and stuff like that. It's one of the largest phosphorus mines in the Americas. The only other one that's bigger than that is in West Africa. Morocco sort of like took it over. It's one of the largest phosphorus mines in the world. So now think of something that the limits to life on this planet are centered around this. And Dan had done this incredible story about it, but it's one of the, one of the elements of that is that it does promote life, right? So if you put too much on the land, if in agriculture you're living through NPK fertilization all the time, this leaches into waterways. And it's part of the reason why we have just enormous amounts of dead zones in our lakes and rivers and streams and in the Gulf of Mexico. And so he goes through all of this stuff that we know is integral to life, but also secondary, the element of it is used in white phosphorus bombs. So it's sort of like Greek fire. You can't really put it out. Elemental phosphorus at anything above, like, I think it's like 87 degrees, spontaneously combusts, and it will not stop until it burns itself out. And so we turn this thing that is so integral to life also into a weapon of destruction. And we find that with nitrogen, we find that with phosphorus, we even find that with potassium in saltpeter that we use for ammunition. And so it's a weird sort of like cognitive, like sort of element to the understanding of those like three things that we use that are elemental to life that are also part of this sort of war machine as well. And then Dan had also done a book on the Great Lakes that was really stunning, that is really long. And he's obsessed with water, right? He's obsessed with what happened to the Great Lakes, a lot of the algae blooms and everything like that. But he tells about this one story about the creating of the North American Mediterranean. And so they built a canal called the St. Louis Causeway, that they built in the 70s in order to bring all of those lakes together so that they could use it for export to Western Europe, and how it just destroyed entire ecosystems. So they wanted to create a Mediterranean, but they didn't think about the long-term cost of it. And so he's a really amazing writer. I just couldn't draw like the passion out of him, and like I wanted him to get angry and or like passionate about it, and I just felt like I wasn't able to do that very well. But I still think the episode is actually really cool.
Yeah. This podcast is made possible by my favorite electrolyte company, LMNT. Started by my good friend and co-author, Rob Wolf, it's a delicious blend of sodium, magnesium, and potassium to keep you hydrated better than water alone. It's sugar-free and has no dodgy ingredients. In addition to hydration, electrolytes are important in regulating your immune system, helping to keep you healthy during the colder months in cold and flu season. My kids and I love the citrus and raspberry flavors, but you can get a free sample pack of flavors when you head over to sustainabledish.com/LMNT and place your first order. There are many guests that I had on that I kind of wish I pushed a little bit harder, but that's just not my interest in this podcast. I can't even tell you, I mean, daily I get emails from PR firms saying, you're a sustainability writer, you should have our vegan chef on because they've figured out a way to blah 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 blah, or this new food, this new fake protein or whatever. And I could easily say yes and then have them on and ambush them. And I don't do it, but there have been a few people that I've wished that I was a better interviewer for pushing back, but that's just not. I mean, I was an art major and then I studied nutrition, so that's I have people on the show that I find interesting, and I'm not interested in making people uncomfortable or whatever. But the one podcast where I did, the next one on my list that I have on here is Florence Williams and her book Heartbreak, which is like the science of heartbreak. And that one was definitely not related to sustainability at all. And, I guess it's kind of a little bit of a stretch. It's sort of health related. But she, went through a divorce similar to me, but she turned it into a book. So she was a writer before. She was a science writer. She wrote about like breast cancer and stuff like that. But then as she was going through all the different phases of her divorce, decided to write a book about what happens when you're severed from a long-term relationship, and that the pain of that is similar, I guess, to the pain of like having a root canal. Like there is an actual physical pain there. And I remember her telling me it takes 3 years, and I was like 2 years in, and I was like, no, don't tell me that. I don't want to hear that. But that's definitely somebody that, again, I just read her book personally, felt really moved by it, and wanted to have her on the podcast. So nothing to do with Regen Ag. But I did get a lot of feedback on that one that people really liked it. So I'm hoping I turned a few people onto her book. So I have a few more on here. What do you have next on yours?
So, well, I want to talk about Ulbe Bosma's book, The World of Sugar. But I also don't want to forget, there were so many people that we interviewed for Sacred Cow that were just really, truly wonderful. All of those interviews are, they're really stunning. And people took time out of their very busy lives, to sort of meet with us, to have these long form conversations, to dive into the details of their worldview. And I think it's really like I think the film that we ended up putting together, the stories, the really passionate moments where somebody said something that would, like, I always go back to like Rob Wolf, where he was like, you can walk in every time I walk into a bodega in New York City, like it always says, you have more food choices than the pharaohs of Egypt or the kings of England. And you walk in, you're just like, you're in awe and you're also disgusted at the same time. And you have to have this mix of emotions all at the same time. There were so many sort of like little bits and pieces in there that I carry with me everywhere I go. So that, like, I want to give a shout out to a lot of the people that we met and took time to kind of like sit down and have those conversations with us.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was really heart-wrenching to see how much ended up on the cutting room floor when it got edited into a real film. And there were actual entire interviews that didn't make it in because the person either, was repeating something someone else said, but then the other person had different sound bites that worked in other places. And so we just went with them instead. But Charles Massey is a really good example of somebody who gave a beautiful, beautiful interview. And in fact, that's the one. So Nelson, my director of photography, who you got to know very well. But that was probably, I don't know, the 10th or 12th interview that he was on with me. And after Charles Massey, he's like, oh my God, I totally get it now. And I'm like, oh, now you get it? Like,
right.
Because I'm trying to convince these guys, snacking on their granola bars on the side after watching, all these things. And Charles Massey is the one who did it for him. And he didn't even make it in. And Frederick Laloy, we only have one little tiny snippet from him in the film. But his entire interview and his entire body of work, all the writings that he's done, he is my favorite writer on the subject of meat because he fully understands the entire argument so well, like as a holistic argument.
Yeah. I recently just saw Charles Massey in another regenerative agriculture film where he's actually highlighted. I think he's the main profile in that, and I think it's primarily focused on Australia. So he does a really good job in that. Yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, there's so many people that I could have listened to more and more and more. We had we I don't know, 70, 80 hours of interviews we'd had to go through to distill it down to a 90-minute film.
Yeah.
And there's just so much less that gets lost. But Ulbe's book, The World of Sugar, it really what he's trying to do, I think, is actually fairly profound. He said that um, the takeaway for me, if you're going to just put it into a soundbite in and of itself, he said the 20th century was the century of oil, fossil fuels, gas. He said the 19th century was the century of sugar. And so when you hear about a lot of that stuff, you're like, wait, you're going to make this argument? Because there's just so much in the 19th century. You have the expansion into the West, you have cattle country, you have the sort of birth of the sort of Western ideal of like what that should look like. You have any number of different things happening with sort of Victorian England, any number of different things. But he is quite literally tracing the long-term ecological deforestation and human damage that was done for this thing that has no nutritive value barely at all. That was a figurehead of wealth that was then democratized and sent to all the sort of colonial parts of the world, so that the English person sitting at their having their tea, um, you know, regardless of what class you were, you had a sugar bowl on there. Um, and the cost to a lot of that, the expansion to a lot of that, the slavery involved in a lot of that is really centered around this one thing. And so as we move through the 20th century and the way that we're talking about food, we seem to really want it to kind of start at the beginning of the 1900s. Like 1907, say, or Haber Bosch, who wanted to start with the industrialization and the mechanization of our agricultural system. But his argument is like, no, so much of this was centered around the distillation of this thing, which is a tall grass, weedy grass, that became sort of a cultural component of all of this stuff, especially with agriculture. So when you're talking about phosphorus, you're talking about Bone Valley, you're talking about Florida, you're talking about slavery, you're talking about all of this stuff.
Mhm.
So it's a really dense sort of academic book, but like peppered with an incredible amount of research. And he's not coming from it from this plant-based versus animal-based sort of argument. He's an academic who studied this very specific thing, that I just found really, really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's reminding me a little bit, and I still need to go back and find, maybe you can find it for me and tell me what page it's on, but there was a brilliant thought experiment that Daniel Quinn did in
Mm,
one of those three books, Ishmael, My Ishmael, or The Story of B, where he talks about this group of humanoid things that find this special salt that gives them a smell,
mm,
and they're
yeah.
called the stinks, and they don't even realize that they stink so bad, and then they find this other thing to get rid of the stinks, but then that gives them like heart disease, or I can't, my memory is foggy on this whole thing, but like it was a really cool story because
Yeah.
it's so similar to the food issues we have today. We're so used to eating these foods that are so unnatural to us that when we start to have all these problems, instead of just removing the unnatural food, we add on Ozempic and all these other things that then cause more problems, instead of just dealing with the first problem.
Yeah. Yeah. See, Chris Kresser talks about that. He said, like Western medicine really says you have a rock in your shoe. We're just going to give you painkillers, right? For the pain that it causes.
Instead of taking the
And
rock out. Yeah.
instead of
That's
taking
an
the rock
easier
out,
way than a group of people eating
the
some
stink.
salts and stuff. Yeah, the stink. But anyway, if you can find that, let me know, because I actually did flip through all three books like three
Yeah.
times looking for that story. And then I was like, did I make it up? Maybe I made it
Yeah. I'm
up.
not
Maybe I
sure.
dreamt it.
Yeah. There's the A, B's, and the C's, which is the A. live off of the B's, and the B's live off of the C's, and the C's live off of the A's. And so a visitor meets them and says, "Oh, oh, this meat is delicious. Where did you get it from?" And they point to the B's and they say, "We eat them." And so the person is disgusted by that because they don't want to see that something is eaten. But within the sort of triumvirate of how our soil eats, our plants eat, and our animals eat, we seem to have a disgust for some of the elements of that.
Mm.
And I remember like teaching in schools, the kids were afraid of dirt, they were afraid of soil, they were afraid of all of those things. So it's not just the one, but
Yeah.
it's very interesting that our modern civilized society is so afraid of the elements that are composed of all three of us.
Yeah.
So,
Wow, this is like the perfect format for our rabbit hole-ish brains, because we can like lightly dive into one thing and then hop over to something else. Uh, so I'm gonna change the subject and go to, I have 3 more podcasts on my list of podcasts. So I'm just gonna rattle them off quickly, and we can chat about them or not. But one is episode 203, Maui Nui Venison. This
mm,
story was absolutely incredible. And I feature a lot of companies on here. I have to this date anyway, no, financial incentive to be promoting them. Their stuff's incredible. It tastes amazing. They sent me some venison. But the cool thing is they're harvesting invasive venison that was brought there by like a prince, or I can't remember what the story was, but someone brought all these invasive axis deer to
mm,
Maui and a few other islands, and there were no natural predators. These deer have completely taken over because Hawaii, it's basically like a salad bar for these animals. They're causing
mm,
massive erosion. They have got to be exterminated. There's like hundreds of thousands of these deer. I may be exaggerating. There's way too many deer. And they go out in the middle of the night and they sharpshoot them like basically while they're sleeping, with all these like super burly CrossFit dudes who go in there and then like sling the venison, the deer on their shoulder, put them onto ATVs, and they process them all at night. And so the deer are killed with minimal stress, and they make these venison sticks that you can buy right off their website that are incredible. They're little
mm,
charcuterie sticks, but they also have fresh venison, and they have a lot of customers that are vegetarian or vegan except for their meat because they know how ethical their meat is. So their whole story, I mean, I was really blown away when I learned
mm,
about them. So I'm gonna
yeah,
gonna shout them out. Um, the 2 others, one is Well for Culture. When I had them on, that's episode 248. I met them also through social media. They are a young Native American couple, young family with 2 cute little kids, and they are fitness influencers.
mm,
And they have a beautiful book that they wrote where they integrate fitness with eating and spirituality, and they talk a lot about how meat is integral to First Nations. And
mm,
it's easy for Rob and I to make that argument. In Sacred Cow, in our book, we did, but these guys do it better because they're actually part of that community, and they're just really articulate, really outspoken about the importance of health and meat's role in that. So I just really love their story and their holism approach to wellness. And then finally, the last highlight that I have is episode 249, Tommy Wood, who is a pediatrician in the Seattle area. He's a professor and an active researcher, and the whole podcast is just about the incredible importance of animal protein to developing humans, especially to babies. And I mean, when he goes through, the problems from B12 deficiency, the critical need for DHA, I mean, we go through all the nutrients, and it is absolutely undeniable that animal source foods are critical to human baby omnivores, and why we need them so much. And a few of the clips from that podcast went like bananas viral on my
Mhm.
social media, just because he's so articulate. He's so sharp about all that. So it's amazing how sometimes you can have a different voice say something that you're thinking, and that's what makes it happen for people. So I'm glad that I was able to expose people to different voices that resonated best with them.
Yeah, and that was talked about when we went and did that UN summit on sustainable livestock. One of the talks was primary researchers were talking about the importance of animal foods just in terms of nutrient density. In developing children and pregnant mothers, and all of this stuff is it's not controversial in any way. It's only controversial in Western countries. Right?
Right.
Anybody who's been working in developing countries. There was one woman who had been doing this for 20 years, and she was like, an egg, a day, any number of different foods that are absolutely integral to like newborn and child nutrition is absolutely insane, stunning.
Yeah, Shirley
The
Chawali.
difference.
I remember. Yeah, the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
1,000 days. I've run into her a few times
Oh yeah. Oh
since.
cool.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah.
Um yeah, it's amazing how outside of the US, where people are not confronted with the overabundance of food, as soon as you get into
Right.
areas where people are not overfed, the question of whether or not to eat meat is not even a question, you know.
Right.
Unless of course, as we mentioned in the beginning of the episode with India, and then you've got religious issues going on in there. But uh and actually I should mention, I have a paper that I don't think I told you about this, but I have a position paper that is being submitted this week to the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I don't know if it will be accepted. I'm hoping it will.
Hmm.
Ty Beal and Frederick Lavoie and another researcher are co-authors on the paper with me. And it's meat's role in solving both obesity and undernutrition. So, I think it's very easy to make the case that that meat is important for people who are suffering from hunger. But it's often very easy for people to say, but, in high income countries, we should be eating less meat, of course.
Hmm.
And this paper that we wrote actually argues against that all people need meat, and we all need to be looking closely at meat intake, and not just assuming that because someone is overfed that they necessarily should be cutting back on meat. It's probably that they're overeating other things.
Hmm. I recently had somebody who reached out to me on Instagram. I interviewed her for Sustainable Dishes podcast. And she I don't want to say too much about her because I think she's going through the nursing program.
Mm.
But she had sent me something this morning that I thought was actually really interesting. She said, have you ever heard of Biosphere 2? And so Biosphere 2 was, I think there was originally a first one, second one. It was a closed containment system that was meant to be an experiment for the colonization of other planets. And so these 8 scientists who had to sort of like live and spend all of their time within agriculture, but also doing experiments, feed themselves, recycle nutrients, do all of that stuff. They had livestock, plus they also had they were growing all of this food. Some of it was feed stuff for the livestock, but other parts of it were recycled. And so over the course of this, I think it was like 2 or 3 years, tried to figure out what is an optimal diet for this that wouldn't So if you think of a controlled experiment, this was probably the closest you'd ever get to a controlled experiment. And so the allowance was typically somewhere around about, I think, a quarter of a pound of meat per week. I think meat was only eaten on Sundays. And most of the people experience pretty acute hunger. And the some people experience it more than others, but most of the people experience acute hunger. They eventually lost about 10 to 15 to 20% of body weight, which is, good on that sort of diet, right, where they're monitoring all of these things. They lost a percentage of but at the end of it, they sort of state that they had sort of gotten used to it, right? So this sort of semi-starvation diet. But I was thinking about it in terms of Eat Lancet because I'm like, that's kind of what they were recommending. Right? So you created this entire ecosystem, but you put people on this diet that is, they tried to measure protein content, fat content, and all of that stuff. But the major elimination of large parts of the meat element of it meant that they were still sort of hungry all the time. And so for me, it was kind of a vision of what like the Eat Lancet diet would sort of feel like for most people.
God,
A bunch of miserable people walking around.
I'm glad I'm 50 now. And not 50
Yeah.
in 200 years from now when that might be, people are going to be listening to this podcast. They had all that access to all that meat, and now we're eating bugs and tofu. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Anything else, James?
Uh, no, I mean, Death in the Garden, we're still working on the film. We've been so far, we have been in Turkey, the Arctic Circle, working with Sami reindeer herders. We've been working, going across the United States. I think the team is actually headed to Kenya pretty soon to go and talk to some of the savory hubs. They're just doing a tremendous amount of work, kind of just creating, I think, the visual detail that we need in order to kind of make the film. So we're continuing to work on that. It may be my last documentary. So I think I'm kind of a little bit over them. Mainly because the barrier for entry for like good documentaries is really centered around pushing people towards plant-based.
Yeah.
And so the barrier for entry for even a great film or an interesting film is really hard. Um, the overall zeitgeist nowadays is to push people towards something else. I recently had a conversation with somebody who's another film festival where they're in upstate New York. Film festival is happening there, pushing people towards plant-based diets. They reached out to the founders of the film festival. They said, "Well, at least could you screen Sacred Cow so we can have a conversation about like the Northeast, right? Like the ecosystem, differences between the Northeast
Yeah.
and all this other stuff." And so we've sort of been trying to do a little bit of back and forth on that, just trying to have a conversation. But nobody even wants to have a conversation these days.
Yeah.
So in some ways, like continue to work, continue sort of like fight the good fight and to do all the stuff that's associated with that, but sort of figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that there's countries like Uruguay who are interested in having me come, who really value what I have to say, I mean, the meat industry is so huge for them. They're I don't know, 96% grass-fed in Uruguay, and it was just a beautiful system, and they're like, what's going on out there? How can we push
Right.
back, so that's what's really fun for me, is trying to help these small sustainable countries or producers to push back against this narrative that at least it's getting more airtime, that it's run by these big multinational conglomerates that are just interested in profit. I mean, I'm glad to see that the plant-based investment bubble is bursting. There's less money going in now. People are starting to realize that consumers don't want it, that it's greenwashing and, just not living up to the claims. And so I probably could have made a lot of money if I had bet against them in the stock market. And I'm kind of kicking myself that I didn't do that. But at least I can sit there with my popcorn and watch.
Yeah. I don't know if we ended up getting into this very deeply. Chloe Sorvino's book, Raw Deal, one of the conversations that we had sort of offline, I don't know how much we ended up getting into it in the podcast. But one of the things she said was the food industry hadn't had a novel product in a really long time.
Yeah.
Right. It's sort of mix and match, right? Add a little strawberry to something, add a little bit more cheese to things.
Right.
This was a novel product that had all of the same elements of, like, say, crypto exchanges or anything like that. It was a novel product that a lot of dumb money went into. And so the Series A and Series B funding for a lot of this stuff was meant to get as much investment as possible, but then excise and get out of there before the plant-based meat, like, essentially fell. And so this was a financial scheme that, like, was, like, from her perspective, this was I mean, she didn't necessarily say it was a scam, but the enthusiasm was misplaced. And there was a lot of the term that they use in terms of, like, financing, what they called when dumb money comes in, that you want to be, what is the term they use? It's called you just need a great, no, it's you need a greater fool. As long as you have a greater fool, then you can always make money. And so you need all of those people kind of operating behind. And so I think what we're seeing right now is the tailings of that. We're seeing a lot of people still trying to invest. I mean, and we've seen the absurdities of the market, right? Corn milk, cockroach milk. We've seen all of the money kind of going into every single aspect of it. I think what will happen now is they're like, all right, well, maybe we can breed insects and maybe they are high protein, but what if we fed them to farm animals instead?
Yeah,
totally. Right? Like, we're seeing some degree of, like, right, black fly larvae, like locusts, all of that stuff. Like, go for it,
Yeah.
But I think we're sort of starting to come back to earth in a lot of those different things.
Yeah. Well, glad to be seeing that movement coming back. Well, James, thank you so much for accepting your forced volunteer role as co-host, unpaid co-host of the Sustainable Dish podcast. I really do appreciate all the energy you put in and all your help.
And for two introverts like us, to start a podcast or do a podcast together, it was definitely psychologically trying.
That's right.
Awesome. But no, I mean, seriously, thank you for pushing me to kind of get out and have these conversations, because you knew I was itching to, like, talk about the things that really matter to me, So I appreciate that.
Good. All right. Well, I think there's a few more podcasts. We end October 31st, 2023. Things will be up as long as I keep paying for the server to host everything. And again, thanks so much for listening, everyone. And
absolutely.
The last couple ones.
Yeah, I really appreciate the audience and everybody involved in it. The editors, the people who had to deal with me.
Oh, yes. Emily, thank you so much.
Everybody.
And Meg before her, Meg did a great job too. So yeah. All right.
Great people.
All right, cool. James, have a nice night. Hey everyone, Diana here. I wanted to let you know that after many years and over 1 million downloads of the Sustainable Dish podcast, I've decided it's time to direct my attention to other projects, including the Global Food Justice Alliance. It's been a true honor to interview so many important leaders in the health and agricultural fields, and I've loved every minute of it. So October 31st, 2023 will be the last episode. Thank you so much for all of my dedicated listeners out there, for your attention, your time. Thank you to Emily, my podcast editor, and to James Connolly, my co-host. Be sure to follow me at Global Food Justice and also at Sustainable Dish. You can get my newsletters, help contribute to the mission that I'm working on to make sure that all people have access to nutrient-dense animal source foods. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening today and for following my work. If you believe in making sure people all over the world should have access to nutritious food, please join my mission through my nonprofit, the Global Food Justice Alliance. Visit sustainabledish.com/join and become a sustaining member today. All sustaining members get free downloads, and you'll be helping get healthy protein like meat, fish, and eggs to food insecure kids. That's sustainabledish.com/join. And thank you.